YouTube channel as we gear up for PMQs Unpacked in, 25 minutes' time. We'll pause the action live from the House of Commons and to analyse the key exchanges in real time. We expect, obviously, the situation in Israel and Gaza will dominate the exchanges, but we'll bring you all of Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, and then Lara Spirit will round up the best of the rest as well. So get online and watch along on the Times Radio YouTube channel. Right now, why are we playing Red Red Wine by Neil Diamond? Good question. It's because it's a nicer version than the UB41. Didn't know it was a cover version. Did you know it was a cover version?
I didn't know it was a cover version, but actually, apropos something in my show, it's actually quite an interesting question because I was going to play Big Yellow Taxi by Joni Mitchell today, which we all know, probably one of the first environmental songs ever. And then I suddenly noticed that there's one by Counting Crows.
Oh, that must be their cover of her.
It must be their cover of it. I never heard it, so I'm going to have a
listen. This Neil Diamond is the original. UB40 was a cover.
No.
Yeah.
Do you know that I worked on that UB40 album and I didn't know?
You went around saying it was a brand new original record.
Yeah, I did, yeah. Fake news. And do you know who wrote about it? Piers Morgan.
Anyway, the reason we're playing this is because there's a story that came out of Nigel Lawson's memorial service yesterday, former
I did, yeah, and I thought that story actually illustrated exactly why he had a daughter like Nigella.
Yeah. So when he was told that he was dying in April, Nigel Lawson apparently dined on figs with prosciutto, mozzarella, and several glasses of red wine, a final Arminac before bed, and 5 minutes later he was gone. And I just thought, that sounds absolutely delicious.
Well, the only thing I would say is he was clearly a man aware of the fact that he had very little time left because none of that required cooking.
That's true. He didn't go for a stew in the slow cooker.
He didn't do a kind of meatball stew, did he? Or a roast lamb.
So I've been asking for, what would you have as your last meal? Nick says, Donna meat and chips. Oh, I mean, it's hard. Someone on crew says, lamb stew and dumplings with spotted dick and custard for afters. Excellent use of the word afters. Sarah says, to be honest, I'd happily share Nigel Lawson's food and bring along a simple classic pasta dish as a main.
I agree. It's got to be a pasta. I'm just thinking.
Cacio e pepe?
Cacio e pepe. That's like aglio olio, isn't it? I think that's just olive oil, chili, and garlic, I think.
So James, this is great. James says, I'd lie in bed with about 20 boxes of Cadbury's chocolate fingers, knowing there'd be no consequences to eating every single one of them. Well, the only consequence, potentially, James, is lots of melted chocolate fingers in the bed, which is not necessarily what you'd want when you were found. 87212, start your rest of the word Times. You can email me, Matt at times.radio. What would you have as your last meal?
Yeah, I wasn't completely wrong in the cacio e pepe. It's actually butter, pepper, salt, and parmesan. My favourite, though, is the other version of that, which is aglio olio, which is olive oil, garlic, a little bit of dried chili, salt and pepper. Used to have it at 3 o'clock in the morning when we got home, when we were bad. Actually, my friend Natalie and I in our younger days.
My friend Richard, who I saw this week, we trained together in Hastings, and he used to do that late of an evening.
So delicious, so much better than a toasty. At that time of the night, to soak up the excess alcohol.
I should say, by the way, morning, Mariella. Mariella's here. I don't think I did that at the beginning.
No, you just take me for granted. What
Not
you should have said
broadcaster.
is, good morning, Mariella. Happy menopause. Happy World Menopause Day.
Happy World Menopause Day.
What have you been up to this morning?
What have you been up to this morning?
Well, funnily enough, I come here fresh, or not so fresh, from the House of Lords.
Wow. Oh, it's finally happened.
Where we launched...
You're going to be one of the young ones in there.
Where we launched this season's menopause mandate campaign, which is basically to get all women across the land to be given menopause information and access to support at the 40-plus health check. Because the unbelievable thing, when you think about the shed loads of money that the NHS needs and is losing, is that although every woman in the land, every man and woman is invited to a 40-plus health check, women aren't given any information in that health check on the one health challenge that they will absolutely, definitely go through in the upcoming decade.
When do you get your invite to your 40-plus?
You get it when you're 40.
Well, I've not had it.
Well, maybe you're NFI. Wouldn't surprise me. They don't even want you at the 40-plus health check.
Can't get an invite to anything.
He'd turn out to the opening of an envelope and he
I can't even get an invite to my own health check. Good morning, by the way, if you're watching on the YouTube channel. Wendy says good morning from Wiltshire. Tom says morning, not expecting a great deal of levity for the green benches today. John says ahoy, ahoy, Peter, ahoy, everyone.
You can get levity here, though, so you don't need to
exactly.
be looking at the benches in the Houses of Parliament, do you? I'm looking for comfort. Have you watched Colin from Accounts?
Yes.
Oh, how good is it?
So good.
So it's my comfort watch, and
Yeah.
I'm asking listeners what their comfort watch is at the moment, because they're bringing back the Wombles as well. And as soon as I hear that tune for the Wombles, yeah, they're bringing back the
Shouldn't they just recycle it?
Very good
Someone like
point.
you
I
once.
like it. But I think that there is always for everyone a sort of comfort watch, isn't there? I mean, with my teenagers, it was Friends. I've never seen the kind of dedication to
Friends.
watching, and they just said it made them feel happy.
Modern Families, constantly on our house.
Beverly Hills 90 thingy.
The Detectorists. That's my favourite.
Is that yours?
Oh, it's very because we watched it during lockdown. It was just beautiful countryside and people being nice. The
Yes, that's
Detectorists.
rare enough, isn't it,
Yeah,
these
I know.
days? Well, I'd like more of that, please. Your comfort viewing for the show today. We will, otherwise, of course, be also looking at the situation in the Middle East as it unfolds and trying to gain some clarity, which is already setting the bar quite high. And we'll be looking at menopause and how it affects your heart and why that is an incredibly important and much overlooked symptom.
And you've got Penny Lancaster on.
I've got wonderful Penny Lancaster, not only wife of Rod Stewart, who increasingly takes my breath away with his brilliant campaigning. I think he was banging on the other day about how we should all pay our tax, which I totally agree with as well. And of course, he's been that
was Berlin, though, wasn't it? It's not Rod Stewart. Take my breath away. You're sailing, you're thinking of.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. He's still smarting from the fact that he hasn't got his 40-plus health check, with or without menopause
maybe they've looked
information.
at my data and thought I'm just so fit.
Maybe they've looked at your baby face and thought, 40, surely not. Do you know what keeps happening to me? I've got a 60 travel card, rail card thing. And every time they ask me to see my rail card, and I find it really quite annoying. And then they look at the picture and they go...
They think you're so young.
And then they look at the picture and they go, good picture. I mean, that's just not charming, is
It's
it?
one of those black and white ones from the 80s.
From the 1920s, when I was in my teens.
Just an etching.
It's a wood carving carved out of my face.
So there we are, 8722. Start the rest of the word times. What's your comfort telly watching?
Do you know, I spoke to a woman. I did BBC Breakfast this morning because it's World Menopause Day. And this woman was coming up the stairs as I was leaving at the ungodly hour of like 7:45 a.m. And she said, I work at the BBC. She said, but I'm totally addicted to you and Matt Chorley on Times Radio. I'm not going to mention her name because that's clearly a sackable offence.
Yeah, don't.
But I was quite interested to hear that.
They do like us over there.
I'd like to
listen.
hear that from the competition.
They all listen.
She said, I'll wear a badge. I said, I think you better not.
Very good. Marianne will be back later on from 1 o'clock. Before that, we'll bring you PMQs Unpacked at midday. It's about 18 minutes away. What can we expect from it? Lara Spirit's here, Times Web box editor. Yeah, turn that music off. It's now serious.
Ow.
Did you just make the noise of a cat?
I said ow, but quietly.
No. Lara, what do we think? Well, I mean, clearly the situation in Israel and Gaza will dominate. Do you think Keir Starmer will do all of his questions on it, given that his position is basically the same as the government's?
Yeah, so that will be, I think, interesting to watch. You're right to say that Keir Starmer has had a position that has been very, very similar to that of the government's. Indeed, his response to the hospital attack yesterday was very similar to James Cleverly's that was initially tweeted. Cleverly now saying that cool heads must prevail with regard to that and that too many people jump to conclusions about who was behind the deadly attack. So I think you could see Keir Starmer asking questions for clarity on, say, the humanitarian response. We know that the government has increased aid to Palestine. We heard from Andrew Mitchell, the development minister, this week about the efforts that the government is going to try and get humanitarian supplies into Gaza. Now, it's possible that Keir Starmer might want further clarity on that and ask on that. But I think you're right to say that as far as their unequivocal support for Israel goes, I don't think you're likely to see a divergence from the Labour leader in that respect today.
It'll be interesting to see then if he does use all 6 questions on Israel, given that, to signal the gravity of the matter, or does he, as David Cameron actually used to sometimes when he was opposition leader, do 3 questions on the serious subject of the day and then come back later on and do something a bit more political, given we've just had party conference season, was the HS2 cancelling, some new plans to sort out the overcrowded prisons, we've got the inflation not coming down in the last month. It's quite a lot of domestic politics.
Yeah, and indeed, it's possible that he may open with remarks regarding the situation and choose his line of questioning on other issues altogether. Indeed, as you say, there are many things that could come up. Besides that, we, of course, have 2 tensely fought by-elections that will be going to the polls tomorrow. You might hear something from backbenchers on those questions as well, including some contentious remarks made by the Conservative candidate in Tamworth. But then the wider public, the state of public services, which is one of Keir Starmer's favourite topics in Prime Minister's questions, as you say, somewhat emboldened by news of prisons overcrowding. This is not something that Labour want to cower away from. We've seen on social media them explicitly highlighting the crisis in Britain's prisons and being as tough as they can possibly seem to be on this issue. So it's possible that, that wider sense that Starmer tries to craft at PMQs of, your public services, they're not working. Government incompetence is one of the reasons for this. I think the news this week means there's some things that Keir Starmer will feel at least could aid him in trying to attack on those topics.
And of course, I'll be interested to see what happens from the backbenchers, from not just the SNP, but Tory backbenchers. Will they? It's been 4 weeks since we last had a round of PMQs. What do you think the mood is amongst Tory MPs?
Well, Rishi Sunak's personal ratings are now as low as they ever have been. There was no discernible confidence bounce for the Conservatives from PMQs. Now, that trio of measures that Rishi Sunak used his conference speech to announce, the smoking ban, A-levels overhauled and the northern leg of HS2 scrapped, are of varying popularity, I think it's fair to say, among his party MPs. I think particularly the smoking ban is pretty polarising, but I had lunch with a senior Conservative MP earlier this week who was so dejected that he just said there was no point being particularly angry about this anymore. So I think that is actually
a sense of the grim inevitability
rather than they feel there's anything they can tangibly do.
Yeah.
Not, especially via openly attacking their Prime Minister's questions. I think given Rishi Sunak's worked hard at being able to open channels of communication with disgruntled backbenchers to air their concerns privately, I think it's unlikely you could see attacks from his backbenchers on this.
We should also say as well, there's 2 by-elections tomorrow. There's Tamworth and Mid-Bedfordshire. I suspect someone will try and find a way of mentioning that at some point.
Yeah, I mean, a Labour backbencher might want to highlight the comments by the Conservative candidate in Tamworth, for example, regarding, benefits and whether or not families were.
You said that people who were looking for benefits but got big tellies should F off, was basically what he said.
That was the effect of it, and then sort of rode in behind his comments when asked by the Daily Mirror, who reported that story first, for clarification. So that might well come up, but also there are already recriminations flowing over the Mid-Bedfordshire contest after that kind of leaked memo from officials to Greg Hands about the idea that perhaps the party's vote share could halve in both of those contests, and that if they lose, Nadine Dorries, obviously the departing MP for that seat, could well be blamed. She's unhappy about the prospect of that on Twitter. So there is some internecine wrangling over that particular contest. Of course, it's important with Mid-Bedfordshire. That is a 3-way contest. That's the Liberal Democrats are still fighting tooth and nail for that seat against Labour. Those 2 parties in particular that have had relatively cordial relations up until this point are really at each other's throats over this election.
It's
So
really
I think you could see that.
They have some seats and they have some seats.
Exactly. And also, of course, what are we going to see from the SNP? We've got Lisa Cameron, who's defected to the Conservative benches.
And
this will be her first.
She's going to be sitting on the Tory benches
She'll
today.
be sitting on the Tory benches today, and rather than patch things up with her former party, the SNP, she has an interview with the BBC recently, rowing in behind comments that it's toxic, that they're incompetent, that she no longer supports independence. Of course, the party's annual conference has just been going on in Aberdeen, so whether or not Stephen Flynn chooses to raise that and recent proposals by Hamza Yousaf and the party's 4th independence strategy, that also remains to be seen.
God, there's a lot to pack in all of that. Lovely to see you, Lara Spirit there, Times Red Box editor. Lara will be back at 12:30, rounding up the rest of the questions. Some of you already posted comments on the Times Radio YouTube channel. John Michael says all of the domestic political stuff will still be here. Starmer should have no fear this government is going to be at all competent anytime soon. He said Starmer should go statesman-like on the Middle East. 6 questions offering support. Tom says, I think Keir Starmer will use today to give us his statesman in waiting sketch. Possibly a good use of an otherwise unproductive half hour. And Mick says, good morning from amazing Stoke. I've not heard it called that before, Mick. I often go there to do my shopping. We will bring you PMQs Unpacked live on Times Radio and on the Times Radio YouTube channel in about 10 minutes' time. Tim Shipman will be here for that. We'll pause the action live from the House of Commons. Up next, there's a big report out today on why we can't build anything in this country. We'll ask the man behind it next on Times Radio.
Download the new improved free Times Radio app today and experience
Good to have you with us on Times Radio. Matt Chorley bringing you PMQs Unpacked in 9 minutes' time now. We're live on the Times Radio YouTube channel, so you can watch along the action from the House of Commons. And you can also see Tim Shipman and I. Tim Shipman and me. We both, you can see our faces. Go online to YouTube, search Times Radio. You can see us online right now. Right, now, you might already seem like a long time ago, but remember this happened. It was only 2 weeks ago. Let's take a listen.
I am cancelling the rest of the HS2 project. And in its place, we will reinvest every single penny.
So that was Rishi Sunak at the Tory Party conference a couple of weeks ago, cancelling the the high-speed 2 rail line to Manchester in a speech in Manchester, while insisting the money will be spent elsewhere. Raises big questions about whether or not we can build things in this country. Well, today, the National Infrastructure Commission, which was set up by George Osborne to advise the government on whether infrastructure is up to scratch, is publishing its latest report. So John Armitt chairs the commission and joins me now. Hi, John.
Hi, Matt.
I mean, there's a lot in your report that we'll try and get through. Let's start with HS2, first of all. Was Rishi Sunak right to say the facts had changed and therefore the time had come to park the leg from Birmingham to Manchester?
Well, what Rishi Sunak was clearly concerned about was the cost, which has been increasing on HS2, and felt that it was a cost that the government was no longer prepared to support. I mean, frankly, we said it was very disappointing. And more opportunity should have been given to looking at, well, how can we continue to put in this vital piece of infrastructure and, look at the scope of works, look at how we can refine the cost, but certainly don't scrap it, because this is something which so many companies have based their economic investments on, they're looking forward to. It was good, you're linking up the 3, London, Birmingham, Manchester, the 3 largest cities in the UK, giving them more capacity on the railway, better journey times, more connectivity, more opportunity for freight, etc., etc. So, yeah, very disappointing, and even more disappointing, quite frankly, that they've decided to sell the land which they bought for the project between Birmingham and Manchester, because that cuts away almost the opportunity to have another look, which I know both Birmingham and Manchester would be anxious to do.
Is that a mistake, do you think, specifically because we've got a general election coming next year? Keir Starmer has not, at this point, committed a Labour government to doing that line. But given the government currently owns the land there, do you think that any decision on completely abandoning the project, selling that land off, should be put off until after the election?
Absolutely. I think it should be put off for a couple of years so that you can have a proper look at what the opportunities are and how we can actually still fulfil the overriding objective here. Rather than sort of close down all the options. Frankly, it just seems very, very strange to cut down the options because, they must think that they might still win the election, so they're preventing themselves from having another look. And equally, we're trying getting infrastructure done in this country on a cross-party basis. We don't want these key infrastructure decisions to sort of fall through the gaps simply because we can't get a cross-party consensus about what needs doing.
And in fact, David Cameron said it would make the decision not to go ahead with HS2 to Manchester would make it much harder to build consensus for any future long-term projects. Do you think that's right? That if every new, and we've had an oversupply of prime ministers lately, but if every new incoming prime minister wants to chop and change, like you said, you've got businesses then that won't, trust essentially the prospect of these big projects. We just end up not building anything.
Well, that's right, and of course a lot of our infrastructure, transport is paid for largely by the government, but everything else, energy, which is probably the most critical issue that we face today and requiring investment in energy, investment in digital, investment in our water systems. All of that is private sector. People can only do that and step up to the plate on that if they can feel confident about government policy. And it's not only prime ministers. We get ministers changing every year, every 18 months. Each minister comes in and thinks that the first thing he should do is dump what his predecessor did and start with a fresh sheet of paper. It's just, frankly, it is just ridiculous. And we need continuity of policy. Without continuity of policy, then it's very difficult to persuade investors. And it's also very difficult to get companies to invest in training. Everyone says, we haven't got enough labour. Well, we'll never have enough labour if, in fact, we can't give companies the encouragement to actually invest because they know that there are going to be steady streams of work coming down the line.
I wondered if you'd had a chance to look at all of the projects that Rishi Sunak had said were going to be done instead, using the money, £30-odd billion that would have been spent on that HS2 line. In his speech, it sounded very much like we are going to do these things. Then a document was published, then it was unpublished, and then they were just illustrations and they weren't firm commitments and it was just business cases and so on. Are you persuaded that they do actually have a plan to do all those projects instead? Or was it a bit of sleight of hand to draw attention away from abandoning that leg of HS2?
No, I'm sorry to say that I don't have that much confidence, and that we've made the point today that what they've now got to do. We had an integrated rail programme before the announcement. We now don't have an integrated rail programme. We have a list of potential projects, some of which have, to be fair, already started. Others, in fact, which have already been built. Clearly it was a hastily put together list. It now needs to be turned into a proper, well-considered plan and programme of works which have got the recognition of what stage they're at, what needs to be done, how much money can be allocated, will be allocated, and so on. And of course, the list is not only rail projects, it had road projects in it as well.
Yeah, of course. Well, we await any more further clarification on that. Let's just turn to something else that's in your report today, looking at how you've warned the supply of natural gas to all buildings must stop by 2050 if we're going to meet our climate targets. There's a lot of faith being put in heat pumps without anyone really being totally convinced that they are practical or efficient enough or will provide the heat that people want in their homes. Are heat pumps good enough at the moment?
Heat pumps are good enough. You've got to put the right heat pump in. And in fact, you need to have a proper survey which understands what are the requirements of your particular property, because they are going to be different, and heat pumps come in different sizes. And if you've got a poorly insulated home, you don't want to spend the money on insulating it for whatever reason, then you simply put in a larger heat pump. The government's own department has actually said that 90% of homes in the UK are suitable. They've equally said that there are 10 million homes which could actually take a heat pump tomorrow. What we've done today is said you can't expect that to happen without providing some significant financial support to people, more than has already been announced. So we've said that for social housing and for people on lower incomes, 100% of the cost needs to be provided to support those people. And for those who are owner-occupiers and so on, they should get £7,000 grant, and in addition, those zero-cost financing to pay for the rest of the work which needs to be done. But
John,
we're
we're going to have to
behind
leave it there.
other countries.
Yeah, absolutely right. John, really good to speak to you. So John Armitt there, chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, that big report out today on how, well, we're not really building anything. Right, up next, PMQs Unpacked, live on Times Radio, the Times Radio YouTube channel.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
It's 12 o'clock. I'm Matt Chorley, and this is Times Radio. In a moment, PMQs Unpacked live from the House of Commons. But first, a look at the headlines this lunchtime. Joe Biden said it looks like the explosion in a hospital in Gaza was done by what he called the other team, referring to groups in Gaza. Israel says it has evidence that the strike was a failed missile launch from within Gaza. Palestinian groups say that's not true and that it was an Israeli attack. We expect that probably to come up in PMQs in just a moment. The Shadow Foreign Secretary is going to ask a question of the government about the explosion straight after PMQs at 12:30. The Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Andrew Griffith, has claimed that although inflation stayed the same last month and in August, the government is still on track to halve it by the end of the year. It's now at 6.7%. Ministers want it down to 5%. The environmental campaigner Greta Thunberg has been charged with a public order offence after a protest outside a London hotel yesterday. 26 protesters have been charged in total. The British Museum has announced plans to digitise its entire collection after some items were stolen. Mark Jones, the interim director, said the steps would improve security and ensure that a theft of this kind can never happen again. And we'll have a full news update in an hour's time. But first, now live on Times Radio and on the Times Radio YouTube channel, it's time for this.
PMQs Unpacked on Times Radio. Unpacking the politics and cutting through the crossfire.
Order, order. I call Matt Chorley and Tim Shipman.
And Tim Shipman, the Sunday Times chief political commentator, is here.
Hello, Matt.
It's the first PMQs we've had for 4 weeks because of the party conference season. You normally expect quite a lot of political knockabout, the fallout, the highs and the lows, your mistakes, your announcements, and so on. But clearly the situation in Israel and Gaza is going to dominate.
Yeah, I mean, Starmer has to go on that to start with. The question, I guess, is whether he splits his questions and does 3 on that and then comes back halfway through to do something else. And, you know, this is an interesting situation because, in a sense, politics has changed a bit since we were last here. Rishi Sunak's had a go at trying to reset his government. I think most people would agree, not wholly successfully. Keir Starmer has cleared another sort of hurdle on his way to Downing Street, but without really kind of totally sealing the deal. And there's just a little bit of nervousness in Labour that this is now a sort of curveball that's come from left field. And can sort of change the game a little bit. It changes the sort of the background noise, and it creates, I think most people would agree, slightly more problems for the left than for the right in terms of how you calibrate support for Israel and criticism where it then becomes warranted. And it'd be interesting to see how Starmer approaches it. You know, up front, he can kind of do what he's done repeatedly since he took over, which is, you know, distinguish himself from Jeremy Corbyn and what went before. But as this goes on week by week, there could be a whole bunch of incidents, and the hospital might have proved to be one of them, though it's now looking less likely that that's the case, where, you know, support for Israel then becomes a political issue. So, you know, let's see how he handles it. But it's certainly not what he would have wanted coming back from conference season. He would have wanted to take the mickey out of the Prime Minister.
I suppose actually, you know, this is talking about the politics when clearly there's far more important things being played out in Israel and Gaza right now. But Keir Starmer actually using this as a way to draw a line under the Corbyn days, appearing prime ministerial, aligning himself with the government, making serious statesman-like statements is no bad thing for a guy who hasn't quite yet crossed that threshold in some people's minds.
No, I think that's absolutely right. But as I say, it comes with slightly more peril for a Labour leader than it does for a Tory one, because there's a lot of people behind him whose instincts, even if they've been keeping their mouths shut in recent days, would be that they are supportive of the Palestinians, and that makes it sort of slightly more perilous terrain. But in terms of speaking to the country, I think for the most part, Starmer is on reasonably solid ground, certainly at this stage of proceedings, in taking a pretty firm line and saying Israel has the right to defend itself. But it's certainly going to be, not the PMQs we thought we were going to get, but in its own way, I think will be equally fascinating.
And it also happens, it happens the day before two major by-elections, and normally you'd expect people asking questions about that to leave the party leaders the opportunity to set out their stalls. Now, we'll bring you Keir Starmer's first question in just a moment, but as often happens with on a big day like this, it's worth bringing you just the Prime Minister's opening statement in response to the very first question, just to sort of get the sense of his message to the Commons this morning. This is Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House will have been shocked by the scenes at Al Ahli Hospital. As my honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has said, we are working independently and with our allies to find out what has happened. I'm sure that honourable members will be raising further questions with me during today's session. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
And it's interesting because James Cleverly, as you were saying, the Foreign Secretary has already been out this morning just saying we just need to take a step back, take a deep breath and wait for the evidence. Because I think, last night we had very senior politicians rushing out to say there is no justification for this without actually knowing who was responsible for it.
No, and both sides are blaming the other. But there are ways of kind of working this out. And I think it's not just politicians that have made a Horlicks of it. Some other media organisations have done too, by jumping in with both feet. And, fact-checking outlets that seem not to have a grip on the facts have also been parading things around this morning on other channels. So it's good to wait. And interesting as well that Sunak said, we are checking independently. We're not just going to rely on what we're told by the two sides of this.
So you've had
Israel are our allies, but there are independent ways that both the British and the Americans in particular will have of verifying what's happened in due course. But these things often take a bit of time.
It's a very small issue, this, but I would just point out that on the BBC News channel, they are currently spelling Keir Starmer's name wrong in all the captions. But
more fact-checking.
More fact-checking
at the BBC.
More fact-checking needed on that. So basically what happened this morning is that James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, said last night too many people jumped to conclusions about the tragic loss of life at Al Ahli Hospital. Getting this wrong would put even more lives at risk. Wait for the facts, report them clearly and accurately. Cool heads must prevail.
And this is a lesson in all these situations. I mean, we've seen it before with a lot of terrorist atrocities or whatever. A lot of stuff flies around on social media and assumptions are made. And the truth is often, barely got its boots on before.
But then you've got the US president goes and says it was the other team.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that that terminology will particularly enhance his re-election efforts. But there we go.
Right, here we go then. This is PMQs Unpacked. We go live to the House of Commons. This is Labour leader Keir Starmer.
Position, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by warmly welcoming the new member for Rutherglen and Hamilton West?
This was the by-election win from last week.
Mr. Speaker, the news last night of hundreds killed at the Baptist Hospital in Gaza is incredibly distressing. But it's much worse for the people of Gaza. Their fear that there's no place of safety is profound. International law must be upheld, and that means hospitals and civilian lives must be protected. Last night, the Foreign Secretary said the UK will work with our allies to find out what has happened. I know this only happened last night, but can the Prime Minister please tell us when he thinks he might be able to update the House on progress with that work?
I know the whole House will have been shocked by the scenes at Al Ahli Hospital. Any loss of innocent life is a dreadful tragedy, and everyone will be thinking both of those who have lost their lives and the families that they leave behind. We should not rush to judgment before we have all the facts on this awful situation. Every member will know that the words we say here have an impact beyond this House. This morning, I met with the National Security Advisor, but also the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. I could tell the honourable gentleman our intelligence services have been rapidly analysing the evidence to independently establish the facts. We are not in a position at this point to say more than that, but I can tell him we are working at pace, but also cooperating and collaborating with our allies on this issue as we look to get to the bottom of the situation, and we will also continue all our efforts to get humanitarian aid into the region.
That probably sets the tone for the rest of PMQs, but clearly Rishi Sunak conscious of the risk of a misstep, and so actually saying nothing is probably better at this point.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the safest position for the government. It's sort of interesting that the hospital has now overtaken any sort of discussion of the issue in the round and what happened, the weekend before. And Starmer very much, putting his old legal hat on and talking about, international law needing to be upheld. That sort of puts it back in his natural political bailiwick. And Sunak as well there, I think that's more frank than you normally get from a Prime Minister about who he's been talking to. I don't remember, apart from at the sort of height of the Iraq War when it became, basically the entire story for a while, people talking about, I've just had a meeting with the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee. I mean, we all know these meetings go on, and that if there's a National Security Council meeting, that the chairman of the JIC would be there. But, that shows, how seriously he's taking it, and also, wanting to make clear that, we're running our own sort of independent intelligence process. So, pretty sombre start. Let's see what happens next.
Yeah, absolutely right. Let's go back to the House of Commons then. This is question number 2 from Keir Starmer.
I thank the Prime Minister for his answer. The terrible news last night came as we are still mourning the terrorist attack on Israel last week. Jews taken hostage, mutilated, slaughtered. And yesterday I met the families of some of the British hostages held by Hamas. Every minute of every hour of every day, they hope for good news, but fear the worst. They know the lives of their loved ones are in the hands of murderers. It's unimaginable agony. Israel has a right, a duty, to defend itself from Hamas, keep its people safe, and bring hostages home. But isn't it clear that if Hamas had a single concern for human life, a single concern for the safety of the Palestinian people, then they would never have taken these hostages, and they should release them immediately.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is important consistently for us to remember that Israel has suffered a shockingly brutal terrorist attack, and it is Hamas and Hamas alone that is responsible for this conflict. Our thoughts are rightly with those who have been taken hostage and their families. The distress they are feeling will be unimaginable for all those affected. I will be meeting with some of the families and offering them all the support of the British government to get their relatives home. We are working around the clock with our partners and allies to secure their freedom. And importantly, in amongst my other regional calls, I spoke specifically with the Emir of Qatar yesterday on this very issue, which we discussed at length. The Qatari government is taking a lead and working intensely to help release hostages using their contacts in the region, and we are working very closely with them to ensure the safe return of the British hostages.
Keir Starmer.
It's interesting there where, because you said that they hadn't referred back to the event which started all this, week and a half ago now, the Hamas terror attack in Israel. He said that Hamas and Hamas alone is responsible for this conflict.
Yeah, I think if, 48 hours ago, that would have been Starmer's opening question and statement. And he was right to pivot to the hospital. But clearly that's the sort of strong message that he wanted to get across there. And I think the language was very evocative, talking about people, mutilated and slaughtered. And I think that phrase, unimaginable agony, is a good one from Starmer. He kind of... the criticism of Jeremy Corbyn was not just that he had things politically wrong a lot of the time, but that when it came to anti-Semitism, that he had no empathy for people who were suffering and felt that they were, marginalised and attacked. and I think a lot of people who knew Corbyn sort of said he couldn't really comprehend why all, the Jewish people were sort of victims. In his mind, they were wealthy and, white, a lot of them, and not sort of traditionally what he would see as the sort of victims of society. Starmer really doing his best to show we understand what you're feeling here. Yeah. He's got a lot of people in his party who would have talked to him about that, and he's got a seat in North London, and he knows those communities. Yeah. The other thing I thought was obviously interesting is that Starmer's seen the families of the hostages before the Prime Minister.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
And that is, a little bit of a coup. And I think Starmer did a very good job of, Sunak kind of repeated some of the phrases and, he's the Prime Minister. But Starmer sounded...
Starmer asking the questions and Sunak answering, but it does feel like Starmer's sort of taking the lead on this.
I think he sounded every bit like a Prime Minister in the questions he asked.
And so Rishi Sunak was talking about making regional calls. There were some suggestions last night that Rishi Sunak might go to Israel at some point. Have you heard any more about that?
I would be surprised if he's not there before the end of the week. But, I think for security reasons, people would prefer it if we didn't say anything more than that. But my understanding is that is very likely.
But there's an interesting question about what impact that might have, given that he'd be the first British Prime Minister to go for almost a decade. David Cameron was the last one in 2014, and partly because for the last decade, British policy has been completely obsessed with itself and hasn't necessarily engaged in the world in the way that you might like. But, bluntly, Rishi Sunak bowling up in Israel now to talk to Benjamin Netanyahu. What impact is that going to make?
Well, I think when James Cleverly went last week, he went at the invitation of the Israelis who were keen to have support on the ground. That was the immediate
aftermath of the terror attack,
the American president is there. There's a lot going on here, and Britain has some role to play in kind of some of these regional conversations about what happens next. We've got long-standing links, not all of them positive, it should be said, to the region. But the Middle East is an area where Britain does have quite a good diplomatic network, does have quite a good intelligence network. We can encourage things, in the direction that we want to see. I think what people who work for Sunak would say is that, while his public performances are a little bit erratic, and we don't always think that he captures the tone or gets it completely right in his speeches or in PMQs, behind the scenes he's quite effective. He likes to do meetings one-on-one with other leaders, genuinely one-on-one, not with a phalanx of aides on each side.
Yeah,
and he feels he gets somewhere with those conversations. And Britain obviously has interests in the area. It's not just about supporting an ally. It's about trying to sort out what happens with our hostages. And we do have hostages there. That we are part of that conversation. And he will want to be able to go and sit in a room with Benjamin Netanyahu and have a blunt conversation about that.
It is. Yeah, if he does go and he can play a role, then that's probably a good thing. The fact that would have been better if he had also been 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago is a sort of a separate point. Right, let's go back to the House of Commons now and let us know how you think this is unfolding. Go on to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Love to see your comments. Let's go back to the House of Commons and Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I also met charities with staff working in Gaza and heard their accounts of the harrowing humanitarian crisis. Children fleeing their homes, hospitals barely able to function. The lights are going out, and the innocent civilians of Gaza are terrified that they will die in the darkness, out of sight. International law must always be followed. Hamas are not the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian people are not Hamas. Does he agree that medicines, food, fuel and water must get into Gaza immediately? This is an urgent situation, and innocent Palestinians need to know that the world is not just simply watching, but acting to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe.
Mr. Speaker, as I said on Monday, an acute humanitarian crisis is unfolding to which we must respond. It is right that we support the Palestinian people because they are victims of Hamas too. And that is why we have provided a further £10 million in humanitarian aid for people in the region. And we are working through preemptively moving aid and relief teams to Egypt, specifically to the El Arish airfield. We are working with local partners like the Egyptian Red Crescent and the United Nations primarily, and deploying Navy assets to the region, as well as exploring how we can support logistical requirements. And I've also raised this issue of humanitarian access in all of my conversations as a priority with every leader in the region, and we will continue working with them to get aid to where it is needed as quickly as possible.
I suppose actually that is an example of something that he might be able to bring some pressure to bear on trying to get some humanitarian aid in.
And if we're marking these answers, a better answer there from Sunak, who was able to show, here are some specific things I've done. And actually, right up front, the British government decided not to cut aid. Others, even in Europe, were pulling aid once the attacks first took place as a kind of punishment measure. And Sunak and his Foreign Affairs Advisor, John Bew, decided very early on that that was a bad idea and that, this was going to be needed, regardless of the rights and wrongs of everything else that was going on. But again, Starmer, poignant language there, people dying in the darkness. I was with some senior people from Starmer's office at an event last night, and they're clearly, very, very concerned about what's going to happen over there. People were talking about, power being turned off and hospitals running out of electricity. And I think the way that this hits anyone who's got kids is talk of children and babies. I think there's...
This is a very different Keir Starmer, actually. Like you said, talking about the lights are going out, civilians terrified they will die in the dark. The language he's using and the way he's delivering it is very different to his usual style.
Yes.
And probably all the better for it. We should just say, we've heard from the Metropolitan Police in the last few minutes about a vigil for the victims of the hospital bombing that took place last night. It's due to take place in Whitehall today at 5 o'clock. It's been organised by some left-wing groups. Lots of the usual left-wing groups that organise these things. The Metropolitan Police have said they're aware of it taking place. They're going to have additional officers deployed to the area to ensure it takes place safely. And they're working with the event organisers to ensure it passes without issues. It's anticipated there may be some disruption to traffic. And he's urged other people thinking of organising events to speak to the police first to minimise any disruption, but clearly concerned that as some of the other protests we've seen in London over the last 10 days or so, a lot of nervousness about that taking place basically right outside Downing Street.
Yeah, these are all potential flashpoints. This is, serious stuff, and it's emotive stuff, and it's already an issue that probably winds people up on both sides pretty much more than any other.
But Chris has just been in touch from Sheffield. Says, forgive me if I'm wrong, but not long ago, Starmer was cheering his gaffer Corbyn to the rafters. Corbyn was the Hamas apologist. I mean, it doesn't feel like that's where Rishi Sunak is going to go today. But that is a point they've pointed out lots of times before, that Keir Starmer sat in the shadow cabinet of Jeremy Corbyn, who called Hamas friends and all those other things.
This is and this will still... we've sometimes taken a mickey out of the Tories for constantly labouring this point, but it is one that I know a lot of people out there do care about, and Starmer was asked about it. His party conference was largely a success story that went off without incident. The one time he looked really uncomfortable was when he was being interviewed, I think it was by Sky News, and they asked him about this and said, well, you didn't resign, and the other people who you're hailing on your front bench, Rachel Reeves, Wes Streeting, people like that, they refused to serve. Starmer obviously, did not see the world the same way Jeremy Corbyn did, but he twice suggested that he become Prime Minister. Now, I think the way he responds to this series of incidents is going to be far more important in terms of what people take away from what Starmer thinks about all of this than what went before. But for some people, that is something they can't get past, that he was prepared to sit alongside Jeremy Corbyn. I think, the cynical political journalist in me would say that Starmer's plan was always to try and win the leadership, and that the only way he was going to do that was going to be to get enough votes from the people who supported Corbyn, and then to move the party in the direction that he wanted to. Now, that may be cynical for people on the right of the Labour Party, and it may be distressing and cynical for people on the left of the Labour Party, but, bluntly, that's what it was all about. And, did he say enough about anti-Semitism when he was in the shadow cabinet? I think most people who campaign on the issue would say no, he didn't. But the first thing he did when he became leader was to deal with it. So, you know.
Well, let's go back.
That's politics.
Slightly conscious of the time. Let's go back. This is question number 4 from Keir Starmer in the House of Commons.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has already been alluded to, since Hamas's terrorist attack, our country has seen a disgusting rise in anti-Semitism. Jewish businesses attacked, Jewish schools marked with red paint, and Jewish families hiding who they are. And we've seen an appalling surge in Islamophobia, racist graffiti, mosques forced to ramp up security, British Muslims and Palestinians spoken to as if they were terrorists. Does he agree with me that every member of this House has a duty to work in their constituency and across the country to say no to this hate and to ensure every British Jew and every British Muslim knows that they can live their life free from fear and free from discrimination here in their own country?
Mr. Speaker, all of us in this House can play our part in stamping out those who seek to cause division and hate in our society. We will make sure that we continue funding, as I said, the Community Security Trust, but also the equivalent protective security grant to protect mosques and other places of worship for the Islamic community in the UK. That funding was increased earlier this year. We will also remain in dialogue with the police to make sure that they are aware of the full tools at their disposal to arrest those who perpetrate hate crimes, incite racial or other religious violence. There is no place for that in our society, and I know this House will stand united in making sure that those who do this face the full force of the law.
Yes, sir.
Well, there we are. The conversation now moving on to anti-Semitism in the UK, which is the conversation we were just having. A few people have messaged to say, did Jeremy Corbyn actually call Hamas and Hezbollah friends? He did. It was at an event in 2009 where he was addressing a group of people in Parliament. He was then asked later if he still regarded them as friends, and he said, no, it was inclusive language I used, which with hindsight would rather not have used. I regret using those words, of course. That was what Jeremy Corbyn said in 2016. So in the interest of trying to make sure we get all the questions in, let's go back and have question number 5 from Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do not want this conflict to harm us here at home, and we do not want it to escalate in the Middle East, where there has been too much bloodshed, too much darkness for too long. A two-state solution, a Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel, feels more distant than ever, but it remains the only way through. Does the Prime Minister agree that because hope is at its thinnest, we must work our hardest to ensure the voices of division and despair are sidelined, and that, however difficult it seems, the hope of a political path to peace is maintained?
Mr. Speaker, it is precisely because it is that vision of a more hopeful, peaceful future that Hamas tried to destroy that we must redouble our efforts to try and bring that future about. And all our conversations that both myself and the Foreign Secretary have had with regional leaders, we've emphasised our commitment to making sure that we make progress on all the avenues that will lead towards that peaceful future. And that has been a feature of both mine and the Foreign Secretary's dialogue. And I'm confident that there is willingness in the region not to escalate this crisis beyond dealing with Hamas, the terrorist organisation, but also to strive very hard to a future where Palestinians and Israelis can coexist peacefully, side by side, and look forward to a future filled with dignity, security and prosperity.
Yes, Starmer.
Again, emotive, smart writing from whoever's helped Keir Starmer write these questions. When hope is at its thinnest, we must work our hardest.
Yeah, and an interesting answer from Sunak there. I think that is, it's not quite news, but, the fact that he's been getting a positive response in his conversations with these other leaders about not letting this spread wider, because certainly in the 48 hours after the initial attack, that was what people in number 10 were most concerned about, that somehow Hezbollah in Lebanon would get dragged in, and you'd then see, other parts of the Arab world sucked into some kind of confrontation. And it seems that there is an appetite not to do that, and that for the sort of strategic peace of the world is good news. But yeah, I totally agree. I mean, Starmer he's done the hospital, he's defended Israel, he's done the aid issue, he's done anti-Semitism with a shout out for the Muslim community at home, and now he's talking about the regional sort of strategy and power structures and the geopolitics of it. This is so far excellent stuff.
In fact, Catherine's been in touch, and this looks like the House and our representatives at their best. Heartening. And I suppose, yeah, you're right. It's a good point, Catherine. But it's also slightly depressing that sometimes it requires a really, really awful international incident for that to happen. Let's go back to the House of Commons, and this is just rounding off PMQs Unpacked. Matt Chorley still joined by Tim Shipman, Sunday Times chief political commentator, but live on Times Radio and on the Times Radio YouTube channel. And this is the final question from Keir Starmer.
This is a crisis where lives hang in the balance, and where the enemies of peace and democracy would like nothing more than for us to become divided and to abandon our values. Does the Prime Minister agree that during this grave crisis, this House must strive to speak with one voice in condemnation of terror, in support of Israel's right to self-defence, and for the dignity of all human life that cannot be protected without humanitarian access to those suffering in Gaza and the constant maintenance of the rule of international law?
Mr. Speaker, I agree. We will in this House speak with one voice in condemning Hamas for perpetrating a shockingly brutal terrorist attack and causing untold suffering on many. And as the Honourable Gentleman said, we stand united in supporting Israel's right to defend itself, to protect its people, and to act against terrorism. Unlike Hamas, the Israeli president has made it very clear that their armed forces will operate in accordance with international law, and we will continue to urge the Israelis to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians, whilst remembering, importantly in this House, that it is Hamas that is cruelly embedding itself in civilian populations.
Andy Carter.
So that brings us to the end of those exchanges. I mean, a united front, but a very British position. Lives are in the balance, says Keir Starmer. Israel has a right to self-defence. That there must be humanitarian access and abiding by the rule of international law. That is a united British position over what is happening in the region.
I think that's right. And the sum total effect of those 6 questions, if you do it well as the opposition, you can set the agenda. And effectively there, Keir Starmer said, this is what our policy should be. And Rishi Sunak said, I agree. And the thing today puts me in mind of most is when David Cameron had to come to the House to answer the Bloody Sunday inquiry report, which was a devastating kind of insight into, things that we had got wrong as a country. It was a very difficult terrain. There were strong feelings on both sides. And I think people who watched him that day think he chose the right words and somehow navigated his way through it. And it was one of his finest moments as Prime Minister. And I've been pretty critical of Keir Starmer a lot of the time in these shows. I think he got that absolutely bang on today. That was his best performance. And, in a sense, it sounded a little bit like he was the PM and the other bloke was just saying, I agree with Nick.
It is, and I think you're completely right. We have at various points been critical of the approach that Keir Starmer's taken, whether or not things necessarily land, or the tone, or the questions, or whatever. But overwhelmingly, the reaction we've had from listeners as well has been, David says Starmer definitely sounded like a statesman, not just a domestic leader. But I suspect we may well look back on that as a sort of turning point. Actually, Rishi Sunak sounding probably more prime ministerial than he often does it at PMQs as well. Right, this is Matt Chorley on Times Radio, bringing you PMQs Unpacked. That brings us to the end of the analysis of Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. Up next, Lara Spirit has been watching the backbench questions to take a look at did everyone talk about Israel, or did other domestic politics come up? We'll find out next here on Times Radio.
Politics without the boring bits. Matt Chorley on
With Matt Chorley.
A very good afternoon to you. It's Matt Chorley on Times Radio and on the Times Radio YouTube channel, bringing you PMQs Unpacked. We've already had the main exchange between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. Lara Spirit, Red Box editor, is here. She was watching the best of the rest. Overall, was it all Israel?
The vast majority of questions were Israel. I would say maybe nearly a third were unrelated, if that, but a very serious tone in the House, and I think not a situation where you would see that many MPs going for kind of inter-party jibes at one another.
So where are we going first?
So we're going to Sajid Javid first, who asked an interesting and important question about whether or not the visas of foreign nationals that commit acts of anti-Semitism or other hate crimes could be revoked, and Rishi Sunak's response, I think, very interesting on this question.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to live in the most successful multiracial democracy in the world. But it saddens me, and I think it shames this whole House, that British Jews have been subject to such vile abuse and hatred in recent days. Anti-Semitism and all hate crimes, they fly in the face of British values. And we should not allow events abroad, no matter how horrific they are, to be used to sow seeds of division in our own country. So whilst I welcome all the actions that my right honourable friend is taking to fight hate crime, to bring people together, may I ask him to consider urgently an immediate and specific policy of revoking the visas of any foreign national that commits an act of anti-Semitism or any other hate crime.
Mr. Speaker, I completely agree with my right honourable friend, who himself has done so much over the years to fight anti-Semitism. The increase in incidents we've seen over the past week is utterly sickening, and this government will do whatever it takes to keep our Jewish community safe. That's why we've provided an additional £3 million of funding to support the Community Security Trust, and we are working with the police to ensure that hate crime and the glorification of terror is met with the full force of the law. Under our existing immigration rules, we do have the power to cancel a person's presence in the UK if it is not conducive to the public good. Mr. Speaker, we will not tolerate this hatred, not in our country, not in this century.
It was noticeable that Sunak, the Home Secretary, was nodding along to what obviously is a former Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, would say.
Of course, and I think the focus of Suella Braverman and colleagues so far has been on trying to make police aware of the powers that they have in the case of protests and of in the instances of active anti-Semitism and other hate crimes. I think this is an issue that goes beyond that. It is talking about the the revoking of visas for those who engage in these acts, and I think moves the discussion even further on from that point, and will certainly be the focus of other politicians in coming days.
We should say there was some politics right at the very beginning of PMQs today, with the arrival of Lisa Cameron, the former SNP MP, who has defected to the Tories, entered the Commons and took her seat. Seemed to be sitting right next to Theresa May. That was just during the Welsh questions, just before PMQs got underway. What else have you got for us, Lara?
So, second question is Stephen Flynn, who is, of course, the SNP's Westminster leader. We'll go to his second question. His first asked if Rishi Sunak would back a ceasefire, which Rishi Sunak declined to do, saying he supported Israel's right to defend itself. But this question focuses on whether or not in the days and months ahead, Rishi Sunak might contemplate a resettlement scheme for refugees, similar to those that we've seen for Afghan refugees and obviously most recently Ukrainians.
Mr. Speaker, my ask for a ceasefire is done with all sincerity to protect civilians, but also to ensure that we have the safe creation of humanitarian corridors. Humanitarian corridors which will allow for food, for water and for vital medicines to get into Gaza, but also for innocent civilians caught up in this terrible conflict to flee. In respect of those who wish to flee, can I ask the Prime Minister what early consideration, if any, his government has given to the creation of a refugee resettlement scheme akin to that previously put in place for Syrian nationals, Afghani nationals and, of course, Ukrainian nationals?
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that we are already one of the most significant contributors to the United Nations efforts to support Palestinian refugees, and our funding supports around 5.8 million refugees annually. And on Monday we announced a significant increase in our funding of aid to the region, including to the UN to support refugees. With regard to humanitarian aid, as I said before, we are already working through preemptively moving aid and relief teams into the region, but critically the most important thing is to open up access for that aid to get into Gaza, which is why our conversations with the Egyptians and others are so critical. We continue to work closely with allies to find every way to get that aid to the people who need it as quickly as possible.
Stephen Crabb.
Yeah, all very similar somber stuff in PMQs today, Lara.
Yeah, very much so. I think, divided between focusing on, the humanitarian response in Gaza, Rishi Sunak on numerous occasions making clear that it is their utmost concern and that they are working closely to see if there's something they can do, both to try and open the Rafah crossing, but also to try and get that aid that they have recently increased into the areas affected. And then also, of course, on the broader picture of Israel's right to defend itself, on which Rishi Sunak has been very clear, but certainly that has been the focus of questions today, you're right.
And another potential way there that this could have some kind of domestic political impact, if the let's set up a settlement scheme becomes the sort of way that people choose to take the domestic debate, that then obviously has some, implications for the government and immigration and all that kind of debate. Again,
And Humza Yousaf was making that point in his party conference speech yesterday. That was what he was calling for, was a big resettlement scheme. Yeah, it's not in his gift, but that was his appeal, if you like, to the Westminster government. Just in terms of the policies, there, we'll step back in a moment. We're keeping an eye on James Cleverly. Is making a statement to the House of Commons in response to an urgent question, but we have already, his line this morning seems to be, let's wait and see. We're trying to get to a definitive conclusion. I think we've got this out. This is the moment that Lisa Cameron, the SNP MP, crossed the floor and formally in the House of Commons defected the Conservatives.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker...
Can I just say to the members, the member was in the middle of asking a question. I think it's disrespectful to your own side. You should think about what you're doing. And can I just say, people should wait. Just because you want to cheer somebody coming in, do it at the right time. Totally inappropriate. Come on, Marco.
So there's some politics happening there, and we'll have some new people in the Commons next week, Lara.
Yeah.
We just don't know who.
Exactly, and I think, the two by-elections will be the source of much recriminations as the days go on, but we have voters going to the polls tomorrow in Tamworth, and there was a question from the Labour MP Karen Smith about whether or not Rishi Sunak would support the remarks of the Conservative candidate there regarding benefits and the sympathy that he has for them. He obviously, in an expletive-filled remark, didn't seem to have a huge amount of sympathy for anybody who pays for a TV and other such things in this diagram. So listen to what Rishi Sunak says here, which is quite similar, by the way, to what the Minister, Andrew Griffiths, said on Times Radio this morning in support of him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Bristol South, around a third of children live in poverty, most of them in working households. It's about the same as in Tamworth, where the Conservative candidate for tomorrow's election made foul-mouthed comments about families struggling to make ends meet. This is his Conservative Party. Will he condemn that candidate's comments?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of our record supporting people with the cost of living. Thanks to the actions that we've taken, we've paid half of a typical family's energy bill last winter, frozen fuel duty, boosted the national living wage to record levels, and 8 million people across this country are now receiving direct cost of living payments worth £900. Whilst we're helping people with the cost of living, all Labour's ideas are costing them a fortune.
Yeah, we'd have probably expected a bit more knockabout on that in a more normal PMQs week. But yeah, it's the allegation the Conservative candidate, Andrew Cooper, had posted something online. It's a sort of complicated flowchart thing, but basically suggested people on benefits who'd got lots of children and a big telly should F off, was essentially the...
Yeah, and his response to the Daily Mirror, who first reported the story, was that most people in Tamworth would agree that benefits are not there to pay for luxuries. So there was no kind of sense of contrition for those remarks. There was actually just the kind of a reiteration of the sentiment, yeah.
So just a reminder, all the candidates in the by-election in Tamworth tomorrow, they are Robert Bilcliffe for UKIP, Andrew Cooper for the Conservatives, Ian Cooper for Reform UK, Sarah Edwards for Labour. The Monster Waving Looney Party's candidate is standing there as well. Sue Howarth for the Green Party, Peter Longman for the Independent, Ashley Simon for Britain First, and Simon Verk for the Liberal
Who's the Raving
Democrats.
Looney candidate?
I was
Matt?
just
We didn't get their
the
name.
list that I was just looking at. I thought was complete, and then it turned out it wasn't. The Monster Waving Looney candidate. Oh, it is Howling Lord Hope.
Oh,
There we are.
good, excellent. He's still with us.
Yeah. In fact, he lives near me.
Does he?
Yes. I don't want to, without giving too much away, he doesn't live in Tamworth. Very good. And
Which will come as a surprise to the
we
people
won't
of
be able to
Tamworth.
discuss the by-elections tomorrow for broadcasting rules reasons, but we'll have all the reaction and the fallout to both Tamworth and Mid-Bedfordshire on the show on Friday. Lovely to see you both. Thanks for that, Lara. What time can you people get PMQs unpacked to their inboxes?
3 p.m.
3 p.m. Lovely to see you, Tim. Tim Shipman, chief political commentator of the Sunday Times, rounding off PMQs Unpacked here on Times Radio.
Times Radio Breakfast, tomorrow morning from 6 on Times.